London hides its secrets behind fog and neon, in the quiet moments between the ordinary and the deadly. Detective Inspector Alistair Finch walks those streets alone, listening to what isn't said, watching what others fail to notice, and piecing together truths most would rather ignore. He is cynical but principled, weary but unrelenting, always chasing the shadows where danger and deceit collide. In a city that forgets nothing and trusts no one, Finch knows one thing for certain: the smallest detail can change everything, and sometimes, not everything is as it seems. The Widow's Shepherd's Pie. Part 1. A Detective Inspector Alistair Finch culinary mystery. Rain moved across London in long silver curtains, softening the gaslight and turning the pavements of Clerkenwell into mirrors of amber and smoke. By 6:30, the city had already folded itself into darkness. Taxi lamps floated through the mist like uncertain ghosts, and somewhere beyond the rooftops a church bell struck the hour with the weary dignity of old iron. Inside the Nag's Lantern public house, however, the world smelled of roasted meat, onions, stout, and damp wool. The pub had stood on the same narrow corner since before the war. Dock workers had once filled its benches. Then printers. Then council men. Now the regulars were mostly aging laborious, widows with sharp tongues, a handful of young office clerks pretending to enjoy bitter ale, and lonely people who needed somewhere warm to disappear into. Detective Inspector Alistair Finch preferred it precisely because nobody important ever came there. He sat alone in the rear, snug beneath a yellowing painting of hunting dogs. His trench coat hung over the chair beside him, steaming faintly from the rain. A cigarette burned untouched between his fingers while he studied the shepherd's pie set before him. The crust was perfect. Not pastry. Potato. Thick ridges browned beneath the grill until the peaks crisped gold while the valleys remained soft and buttery. Steam escaped through a crack in the surface carrying scents of rosemary, lamb, carrots, and onion rich enough to silence conversation. Finch took another bite slowly. "Still thinking like a detective," said the landlady. Mrs. Beatrice Hargreaves stood beside the table with her arms folded across a flour-dusted apron. She was 60 if she was a day, broad-shouldered and iron-backed, with silver hair pinned tightly beneath a scarf. Her late husband had run the pub until a heart attack dropped him dead beside the dartboard 12 winters earlier. Since then Beatrice had run the Nag's Lantern alone and terrified half the borough doing it. Finch chewed thoughtfully. "I'm thinking," he said at last, "that if the French had invented shepherd's pie they'd call it cuisine." Beatrice snorted. "Frenchmen don't understand potatoes." That may be the wisest sentence spoken in London this evening. A rare smile touched her face before disappearing again. Finch had known her nearly 15 years. Not closely. Finch was not close with many people. But the Nag's Lantern had become one of the few places in London where silence between two people felt earned rather than awkward. She topped off his pint. "You look tired." "I'm tired." "Murder." "When isn't it?" "Fair point." She started away, then hesitated. "You'll be here Thursday, won't you?" "Depends who dies between now and then." "You promised." Finch sighed theatrically. "Yes, yes. Your charity supper. It matters to the neighborhood. Everything matters to the neighborhood. That's because the neighborhood still remembers how." There was no arguing with her once she reached that tone. Thursday night at the Nag's Lantern was the annual church relief supper. Cheap food, raffle prizes, old pensioners, and local families raising money for winter heating assistance. Beatrice made enormous trays of shepherd's pie every year because it fed people cheaply and somehow managed to taste like safety. Finch suspected half the district attended less for charity than for her cooking. "I'll come," he said. "You'd better." She moved back toward the kitchen. At the bar, two railway men argued football. Somewhere near the front door a woman laughed too loudly. Rain rattled softly against the windows. For one brief moment Finch allowed himself the dangerous illusion that the world was manageable. Then the telephone rang. Everyone in the pub looked toward the wall behind the counter. Beatrice frowned. No good ever comes from phones after dark. Finch already knew the call was for him. She lifted the receiver. "Yes." "He's here." Her eyes shifted toward Finch. The room seemed to cool by several degrees. She handed him the phone. "It's Sergeant Bell." Finch took it. "Bell." The young sergeant sounded breathless. "Sir, we've got a situation in Clerkenwell. You'll need to narrow that down. A woman's dead." Finch closed his eyes briefly. "Who?" "Mrs. Evelyn Mercer." The name meant nothing for half a second. Then it did. Finch sat upright. "The war widow?" "Yes, sir." Damn. Everybody in Clerkenwell knew Evelyn Mercer. She had spent 20 years organizing church drives, pensioner meals, relief collections, and tenant protests. Tiny woman. Sharp nose. Kind eyes. One of those tireless neighborhood figures who somehow held entire streets together with lists, casseroles, and moral pressure. How? "That's the trouble, sir. We don't know." "Where is she?" "At the church hall beside St. Jude's." Finch glanced toward Beatrice. "Thursday's charity supper preparations. I'm on my way." He hung up slowly. Beatrice watched his face carefully. "What happened?" "Evelyn Mercer is dead." The pub fell quiet despite itself. Even the railway men stopped arguing. Beatrice removed her glasses. "No. I'm afraid so." "How?" "We don't know yet." Her expression hardened the way London expressions often hardened when grief had no room to breathe. "Well," she said quietly, "you'd better find out." The church hall smelled of wet coats and boiled vegetables. Uniformed constables held back a cluster of worried pensioners near the entrance while detectives moved carefully between folding tables decorated with paper flowers and raffle baskets. At the center of the hall stood 3 enormous baking dishes of shepherd's pie. One untouched. One half served. One overturned across the floor like the wreckage of a ship. Finch stepped inside beside Sergeant Daniel Bell, whose notebook was already soaked from the rain. Bell was 30, eager, intelligent, and perpetually worried he was about to disappoint somebody. "What do we have?" Bell lowered his voice. "Victim collapsed approximately 20 minutes before ambulance arrival. Witnesses say she was serving food when she suddenly couldn't breathe." "Age?" 68. "Any known conditions?" "Nothing severe according to neighbors." "Doctor?" "On scene." Finch removed his hat slowly. "And the pie?" Bell glanced uneasily toward the spilled dish. "That's why people are frightened." A woman sat crying near the wall while a constable comforted her. Bell continued quietly. 3 others became ill after eating. Finch's eyes narrowed. "How ill?" "Nausea. Sweating. One collapsed briefly." "Poison." The word arrived silently between them. Finch walked toward the body. Evelyn Mercer lay beneath a white sheet beside the serving table. One small hand remained visible, curled inward as though still clutching a serving spoon. Dr. Leonard Weiss crouched nearby examining a tray. The elderly pathologist looked up. "Evening, Finch. Miserable weather for murder." "You think it's murder already?" "I think 4 people falling ill at the same supper deserves pessimism." Finch looked toward the shepherd's pie. Golden mashed potatoes. Rosemary sprinkled lightly across the crust. Comfort food. Ordinary food. That was always the unsettling thing about poison. It transformed kindness into suspicion. "Symptoms?" Finch asked. "Rapid onset. Difficulty breathing. Muscular distress. Possible convulsions in one patient." "Arsenic?" "Not likely." "Cyanide?" "No almond odor." Weiss straightened slowly with a grimace. "Could be contamination. Could be deliberate poisoning. Too early to say." Finch studied the hall. Volunteers whispered in frightened clusters. Elderly men sat pale-faced clutching cups of tea they no longer trusted. Half-eaten meals remained abandoned on tables everywhere. Fear spread faster than toxins. "Who prepared the food?" Finch asked. Bell consulted notes. "Mostly volunteers. But according to witnesses, Mrs. Mercer insisted on making the main shepherd's pies herself. Alone. Apparently. Finch moved toward the serving table. Plates remained scattered where panic interrupted dinner. One still held a perfect untouched square of shepherd's pie. Steam no longer rose from it. He stared at the browned potato crust. How many portions served? About 40. And only 4 sick. So far. Finch crouched carefully beside the fallen baking dish. Something caught his eye near the edge of the shattered ceramic. A sprig of fresh rosemary. Not unusual by itself. Except the herb appeared strangely crushed and damp compared to the others baked into the potato crust. Finch leaned closer. There was a faint odor beneath the food. Not culinary. Medicinal. Sharp. Almost bitter. He looked up at Bell. Seal the kitchen. Yes, sir. No one leaves until we speak to them. Bell nodded and moved off. Finch remained crouched beside the ruined shepherd's pie while rain tapped softly against the church windows. Somewhere in the hall an old woman began quietly praying. And for the first time that evening, Detective Inspector Alistair Finch had the uncomfortable feeling that somebody had hidden murder inside something meant to nourish the lonely. Part 2. The kitchen behind St. Jude's Church Hall was built for another century. Its cracked tile walls sweated from heat and steam. Industrial kettles lined one side of the room beside dented aluminum counters worn smooth by decades of parish suppers, funeral teas, and Christmas collections. The odor of cooked lamb still hung thick in the air beneath sharper scents of bleach and wet wool carried in from the storm. Detective Inspector Alistair Finch stood near the preparation table while uniformed officers labeled serving bowls and wrapped utensils into evidence sacks. Nothing looked murderous. That was the trouble. A poisoned dagger carried a certain honesty. A revolver announced its intentions plainly enough. But a shepherd's pie? A meal made to feed pensioners and widows? There was something indecent about it. Dr. Weiss carefully lifted one of the remaining casserole dishes. Interesting. Finch glanced over. You've found something. Perhaps. The pathologist pointed with a gloved finger. Notice this tray here. Finch stepped closer. One half of the brown potato topping appeared slightly darker than the other. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Finch to remember. You think the mixture wasn't evenly distributed? I think, Weiss said carefully, that if poison exists in this dish, it may have been added after cooking rather than before. Bell looked up from across the room. How would that work? Weiss pointed toward the garnish tray. Fresh rosemary sprigs still lay piled beside a bowl of melted butter and a pastry brush. A finishing glaze perhaps. Something brushed over the top. Finch studied the pie silently. Not mixed into the meat. Not hidden in the gravy. Painted across the surface. Meaning the killer could control which portions received the poison. Which meant Evelyn Mercer herself might not have been the intended victim at all. That thought settled heavily into the room. Who served the first portions? Finch asked. Bell checked his notebook. Mrs. Mercer served initially. Then 2 volunteers helped. Names. Agnes Doyle and Peter Wilkes. Separate them. Bell nodded. Finch moved toward the rear pantry. The shelves inside held sacks of potatoes, canned peas, onions, flour, and donated tins stacked in uneven towers. Parish kitchens always looked faintly apocalyptic. Enough preserved food to survive either winter or war. A handbag sat abandoned atop a chair. Bell appeared beside him. Mrs. Mercer's. Finch opened it carefully. Reading glasses. Receipts. Peppermints. A small notebook filled with names and donation figures. And an envelope. He removed it slowly. Inside were several folded bank notices. Final notices. Overdue balances. Threats of repossession. Bell frowned. I thought she lived alone in a council flat. She did. Finch studied the papers. But apparently she was in debt. Could that matter? Everything matters. He slipped the envelope back into the bag. What do we know about family? 1 son. Malcolm Mercer. Live somewhere in Essex, I think. Relationship. Belle hesitated. Neighbors say not good. Of course not. Noirs were built on unhappy families the way London was built on rain. From the hall came the sound of raised voices. Finch stepped back through the swinging kitchen doors. A heavy-set man in a brown overcoat argued with a constable near the entrance. I've told you already, she was fine when I left. Belle muttered quietly. That's Peter Wilkes. Volunteer server. Mid-50s. Thick neck. Graying sideburns. Smelled faintly of beer and cigarette smoke even from across the room. Finch approached calmly. Mr. Wilkes. The man turned. You the inspector? I'm afraid so. Wilkes rubbed rainwater from his scalp. This whole thing's bloody madness. You worked the supper. Every year. What exactly did you do tonight? Carried trays. Served plates. Same as always. Did you touch the food in the kitchen? Only to carry it. Did anyone argue with Mrs. Mercer? No more than usual. Finch paused. What does that mean? Wilkes gave a tired shrug. She liked things done proper. Some people resent that. Some people resent breathing. Not untrue. Finch studied him quietly. Where were you when she collapsed? Right beside her. And? Wilkes swallowed. She dropped the serving spoon. Started choking. His voice softened slightly. I thought it was her heart. Did she say anything? No. Nothing at all. The man hesitated. One thing maybe. What? She said. He frowned, trying to remember. That's odd. Finch exchanged a glance with Belle. That's odd. Not exactly a dying declaration. But people often spoke plainly in the final seconds before terror arrived. What was odd? Finch asked. Wilkes shook his head. No idea. Across the hall another volunteer sat waiting near the coat rack. Agnes Doyle looked like the sort of woman who apologized to furniture after bumping into it. Thin. Nervous. Early 60s. Her hands twisted constantly in her lap. Finch sat opposite her. You helped serve? Yes. Did you notice anything unusual? No. Anyone enter the kitchen unexpectedly? Well, she hesitated. Yes. There was a man. Belle looked up. What man? I don't know his name. Tall fellow. Dark coat. When? Before supper started. Why didn't you mention this earlier? I didn't think. Nobody thinks, Finch muttered. Agnes flushed. He asked for Mrs. Mercer privately. Finch leaned forward slightly. Did you hear the conversation? No, sir. But she seemed upset afterward. How upset? She cried. That stopped Finch cold. Evelyn Mercer cried. Agnes nodded. Only briefly. Then she washed her face and went back to cooking. Finch lit a cigarette slowly. What did the man look like? 40 maybe. Dark hair. Gloves. Anything distinctive? He limped slightly. Belle immediately scribbled notes. Did anyone else see him? I don't know. Finch stood. And you told nobody this? I didn't think it mattered. Again that word. Mattered. Everything mattered. Especially grief. Especially fear. Especially strangers arriving before death. By 10:30 the rain had become a full storm. Finch and Belle drove through slick streets beneath trembling sodium lights while windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. Belle kept glancing toward his notes. You think the visitor killed her? I think people rarely cry before dinner for harmless reasons. Could have been debt collectors. Debt collectors don't wear gloves indoors unless they're planning unpleasantness. Belle drove another block before speaking again. There's something else. There always is. One of the hospital patients recovered enough to speak. Finch looked over. And she said the shepherd's pie tasted bitter. Finch's eyes narrowed. How bitter? She described it as medicinal. The same odor Finch noticed near the rosemary. Outside, neon reflected across flooded pavement in streaks of red and blue. Any toxicology yet? Preliminary only. Doctor suspects digitalis. Finch stared ahead. Digitalis. Derived from foxglove flowers. Dangerous in small doses. Deadly in larger ones. A poison old enough to feel almost antique. Bell frowned thoughtfully. Isn't foxglove sometimes used medicinally? Yes. For heart conditions? Yes. Bell's expression slowly changed. Evelyn Mercer had heart trouble. Maybe. And if she took heart medication already? Then additional digitalis might kill her quickly while merely sickening others. The realization settled between them like cold fog. Not random poisoning. Targeted poisoning. The killer expected Evelyn Mercer to die first. Bell exhaled slowly. So the poisoned portions weren't accidental. No. Finch watched rain stream across the windows. Someone prepared that pie specifically for her. The Nag's lantern was still open when Finch arrived near midnight. Mrs. Beatrice Hargreaves stood behind the bar polishing glasses with the grim concentration of a woman trying not to worry. She looked up immediately. Well. Murder, Finch said. The word seemed to dim the room. Several regulars quietly lowered their eyes. Beatrice poured whiskey without asking whether he wanted it. Finch accepted. Evelyn. Poison most likely. Her face hardened with genuine pain. That poor woman. She knew she was in danger. What? She met with someone before supper. Upset her badly. Beatrice stopped polishing the glass. When? Tonight. Her expression changed subtly. Not surprise. Recognition. Finch noticed immediately. You know something. I know people. That isn't the same thing. In this neighborhood it usually is. She leaned both hands on the counter. Evelyn's son came by Tuesday. Malcolm Mercer. Yes. What happened? Argument. About. Money. Finch waited. Beatrice sighed heavily. She loaned him nearly everything after his divorce. How much? Enough to threaten losing her flat. The overdue notices. Finch drank quietly. Did he repay her? No. Did witnesses hear the argument? Half the pub heard it. What did they argue about? She finally cut him off. And she told him she was changing her will. Bell looked sharply at Finch. Inheritance. Of course. The oldest motive in London. Beatrice's voice lowered. She said she'd rather leave her money to the church kitchen than watch him gamble it away. Finch stared into his whiskey. Outside, thunder rolled over Clerkenwell. And somewhere in the city, a man with a limp had walked into a church supper carrying death disguised as comfort food. Part 3. By morning the rain had turned London the color of dishwater. Detective Inspector Alistair Finch stood outside a narrow terraced house in Essex while Sergeant Bell checked the address against his notebook for the third time. You think he'll run? Bell asked. If he's guilty, possibly. And if he's innocent? He'll still want a solicitor. Finch climbed the short path and knocked. No answer. He knocked again harder. At last footsteps approached from inside, followed by the scrape of bolts. Malcolm Mercer opened the door wearing yesterday's shirt and the expression of a man already losing an argument with life. He resembled his mother around the eyes, though bitterness had thickened everything else. Mid-40s. Unshaven. Hands stained yellow from cigarettes. Behind him the small front room smelled faintly of stale whiskey and racing forms. He saw the detectives and immediately looked tired. This about my mother? Yes. She dead? Finch studied him carefully. Nobody ever reacted exactly the same way to death. Some shouted. Some wept. Some froze. But Malcolm Mercer simply leaned against the doorframe as though exhaustion had finally become physical. "When?" he asked quietly. "Last night." His eyes closed briefly. Bloody hell. Not performance. Finch had seen enough grief to recognize the real thing. "We need to ask you some questions." Mercer nodded numbly and stepped aside. The sitting room looked half repossessed already. Bills covered the table. Empty ashtrays overflowed beside betting slips and cold teacups. A framed photograph of Evelyn Mercer sat crookedly atop the television set. Finch noticed it immediately. People who truly hated their mothers rarely displayed them in the living room. Mercer poured himself water with shaking hands. "She hated this place," he muttered. "Why?" "Said it smelled like failure." "Did it?" Mercer almost smiled. "Usually." Bell opened his notebook. "When did you last see your mother?" "Tuesday." "At the Nag's Lantern?" "Yes." "You argued?" "We always argued lately." "About money?" Mercer gave a hollow laugh. "What else is there?" Finch moved slowly around the room. "Your mother intended to change her will." Mercer stared at him. "She told you that?" "She told several people." The man rubbed both hands over his face. "She said she was done rescuing me." "Were you angry?" "Of course I was angry. Angry enough to kill her." Mercer looked up sharply. "I didn't poison my mother." Finch said nothing. "I didn't," he repeated more quietly. "Where were you last night?" "At work." "Doing what?" "Night inventory at Kessler Storage Depot." "Anyone confirm that?" "Half the bloody warehouse." Bell wrote quickly. Finch studied the man a little longer. Grief sat awkwardly on him, buried beneath years of disappointment and resentment. But something still felt wrong. Not guilt. Fear. "Mr. Mercer," Finch said gently, "did your mother seem frightened recently?" Mercer hesitated. "Yes." "Of whom?" "She wouldn't say." "Try." He swallowed hard. "She thought someone was stealing from the church fund." Bell looked up immediately. "What fund?" "The winter relief account." Finch exchanged a glance with Bell. "How much money?" "Couple £1,000 maybe." "When did she discover this?" "A few weeks ago." "And she told nobody officially?" "She didn't trust police." Finch almost smiled at that. Sensible woman. Mercer continued quietly. "She said if she accused the wrong person it'd destroy the parish." "What did she intend to do?" "She was checking records herself." Bell frowned. "So she was investigating?" "Yes." Finch lit a cigarette slowly. A widow running a church charity kitchen uncovering financial theft. Then dying before a public supper. The shape of the thing was changing. Did she suspect anyone specifically? Mercer hesitated again. "Yes." "Who?" "She wouldn't give me a name." "Why not?" "Because," he said bitterly, "she still believed people could confess if given the chance." Back at Clerkenwell station, the church account books covered Finch's desk like battlefield maps. Bell flipped through ledgers while rain tapped steadily against the office windows. "There are withdrawals here that don't make sense." "How much?" "Nearly 3,000 over 6 months." "Cash?" "Mostly." Finch leaned back in his chair. For some people, £3,000 meant greed. For others, desperation. "What about access?" he asked. Bell consulted notes. Only 3 people handled relief funds regularly. Evelyn Mercer, Father Connolly, Anne. He stopped. "And?" "Peter Wilkes, the volunteer server." Finch nodded slowly. "Bring him in." Peter Wilkes arrived irritated rather than frightened. That interested Finch immediately. Truly innocent men usually arrived nervous. Guilty men often arrived defensive. Wilkes sat heavily across from Finch beneath the humming station light. This really necessary? Yes. I already answered questions. And now you'll answer better ones. Bell placed photocopies of the account ledgers on the table. Wilkes glanced at them once, then looked away too quickly. Finch noticed. These church funds are missing money. I wouldn't know about that. You had access. So did others. Mrs. Mercer suspected theft. Wilkes's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Did she accuse you? No. Did she intend to? No. Finch leaned forward slightly. Mr. Wilkes, did you visit the church before supper yesterday? No. Witnesses saw a tall man with a limp. Wilkes said nothing. Bell spoke quietly. You limp from an old dock injury. Still silence. Finch slid a photograph across the table. It showed Evelyn Mercer smiling beside volunteers during the previous year's supper. Peter Wilkes stood beside her. Close beside her. Comfortably close. Were you having a relationship with Mrs. Mercer? Wilkes stared at the photograph for several long seconds. Then his shoulders sagged. Yes. Bell blinked in surprise. How long? 8 years. Secret. Of course secret. He laughed bitterly. This neighborhood treats romance after 60 like a contagious disease. Finch studied him quietly. Did you love her? Yes. The answer came instantly. Not rehearsed. Not embarrassed. Simply true. And did she discover you were stealing from the fund? Wilkes looked genuinely stunned. I wasn't stealing. The money vanished. I borrowed some. Bell frowned. Borrowed. My daughter needed surgery last year. Without permission. I intended to replace it. But didn't. Wilkes rubbed tired eyes. She found out 2 weeks ago. And she was furious. Enough to end the relationship. Pain crossed the man's face. She said she couldn't trust me anymore. Finch let silence settle heavily. Then, did she threaten police involvement? No. But she intended to expose the missing money publicly. Wilkes looked down. She said honesty mattered more than embarrassment. The room remained quiet except for distant typewriters beyond the corridor. Finally Finch asked the question that mattered. Did you poison her? Wilkes looked up slowly. No. Finch believed him. Not completely. But enough. You may go for now, Finch said. Bell waited until the man left before speaking. You think he's innocent? I think he loved her. People kill people they love all the time. Yes, Finch said softly. But usually loudly. Bell frowned. What does that mean? It means poison is often a cold crime. Finch stood and crossed toward the evidence table near the wall. 3 labeled containers held samples from the shepherd's pie. He stared at them thoughtfully. Something still bothered him. Not the money. Not the son. Not even the secret affair. The poison itself. Digitalis. Foxglove. A strangely old-fashioned choice. He looked toward Bell suddenly. The garnish. What about it? The rosemary. Bell blinked. What about rosemary? Fresh rosemary doesn't hide bitterness very well. Bell frowned deeper. So if someone brushed poison onto the pie deliberately, they'd need something strong enough to mask the taste. Finch's eyes narrowed slowly. Butter. The melted butter glaze. Not added for appearance. Added to carry the poison. His gaze shifted toward the evidence containers again. Then lower. To the serving utensils bagged separately nearby. One item sat isolated from the others. A pastry brush. Finch walked toward it carefully. The bristles appeared faintly green. Rosemary residue perhaps. Or something else. Get Weiss, Finch said quietly. Bell looked up. You found something. Maybe. What? Finch stared at the brush. I think somebody poisoned the pie one serving at a time. Dr. Weiss arrived an hour later smelling faintly of pipe smoke and annoyance. You detectives always discover revelations after lunchtime. Finch handed him the evidence bag. The pastry brush. Weiss examined it beneath the lamp. HM. The poison may have been applied selectively. The doctor adjusted his spectacles. That would explain the uneven symptoms. Can you test residue? Of course. How quickly? Weiss gave him a wounded expression. I'm a pathologist, Finch, not a magician. Pity. The old man ignored him and peered closer at the bristles. Then he paused. That's odd. Finch's expression sharpened immediately. What? Weiss turned the brush slightly beneath the light. These fibers aren't pastry fibers. What are they? The doctor looked up slowly. They are floral. A silence settled into the office. Bell spoke first. Floral. Weiss nodded once. As in flower residue. Finch felt the pieces shifting again somewhere beyond visibility. Foxglove flowers. Digitalis. A church supper. And now flower residue hidden inside the brush used to glaze the shepherd's pie. Weiss carefully resealed the evidence bag. Then he said the sentence that changed the entire investigation. Inspector, whoever prepared this poison likely had knowledge of medicinal plants. And suddenly Finch no longer believed this murder had begun in the church kitchen at all. Part 4. The rain finally stopped sometime before dawn. London emerged from the storm pale and exhausted beneath a sky the colour of wet ash. Water dripped steadily from gutters outside Clerkenwell station while milk lorries rattled through the waking streets. Detective Inspector Alistair Finch had not slept. He stood at the office window with a cup of tea gone cold in his hand while Sergeant Bell sorted statements behind him. Foxglove. Medicinal knowledge. Selective poisoning. Not rage. Not panic. Precision. The kind of murder committed by somebody patient enough to wait until kindness itself became the weapon. Bell broke the silence. We got the hospital reports. Finch turned. And? All surviving victims are stable. Good. The poison exposure was mild in most portions. Finch nodded slowly. Because most portions were never intended to kill. Only one was. Anything else? Bell hesitated. One odd thing. There's always one odd thing. The victims who became ill all received servings from the same side of the tray. Finch closed his eyes briefly. Of course. The glaze had been brushed only across one section. Enough poison for Evelyn Mercer. Collateral sickness for anyone nearby. He turned back toward the desk. What do we know about medicinal plant knowledge connected to the parish? Bell checked his notes. Not much officially. But there is one person. Who? Margaret Vale. The name meant nothing immediately. She runs the community garden behind St. Jude's. Finch frowned faintly. The gardening volunteer. Yes. Former nurse apparently. Now that mattered. Still local. Lives 3 streets over. Finch reached for his coat. Let's go gardening. Margaret Vale's house stood beside a narrow alley overflowing with climbing ivy and neglected flower pots. The small front garden bloomed despite the miserable weather. Lavender, sage, rosemary, and foxglove. Tall purple foxgloves swayed gently beside the gate like silent witnesses. Bell noticed them at the same moment Finch did. Neither spoke. Margaret Vale answered the door wearing a wool cardigan and gardening gloves stained with soil. Early 60s. Thin-faced. Calm eyes. Too calm. Yes. Finch showed his identification. We'd like to ask some questions regarding Mrs. Mercer. A flicker crossed her expression. Pain perhaps. Or calculation. What happened to Evelyn was terrible. You were friends. Everyone at St. Jude's was friends. That isn't quite the same thing. Her eyes hardened slightly. No, Inspector. I suppose it isn't. She allowed them inside. The sitting room smelled strongly of dried herbs. Bundles hung from ceiling hooks beside old nursing textbooks and gardening journals stacked across a side table. Belle wandered subtly toward the shelves. Finch remained focused on Margaret Vale. You have medical training. I was a nurse 20 years. Cardiology. A tiny pause. Yes. There's foxglove in your garden. It's common in English gardens. Not usually beside rosemary. Another pause. This one longer. Margaret folded her hands carefully. What exactly are you accusing me of? Nothing yet. Finch removed a photograph from his coat pocket. The pastry brush. Green residue visible along the bristles. We found floral particles mixed with rosemary glaze used on the shepherd's pie. She stared at the photograph without speaking. Belle quietly examined a shelf nearby. Inspector. Finch glanced over. Belle held up a small amber medicine bottle. Digitalis tablets. Prescribed legally. Margaret saw it and sighed once, softly. Well, she said. I suppose that's that. Belle stiffened immediately. Finch watched her carefully. No panic. No denial. Only exhaustion. Tell me, he said quietly. Margaret sat slowly in the armchair near the window. For several moments she simply looked at the garden outside. When you spend enough years nursing dying people, she said at last, you learn something unfortunate. What's that? Some people are cruelly difficult to save. Belle stepped forward. You poisoned Evelyn Mercer. Margaret looked genuinely shocked. What? No. Finch said nothing. She was my friend, Margaret whispered. Then explain the digitalis. Tears welled suddenly in her eyes. I was trying to protect her. The room fell still. Margaret pressed trembling fingers against her forehead. Evelyn discovered the thefts months ago, she said quietly. Not Peter's borrowing. Something worse. Finch remained motionless. What worse? Father Connolly. Belle blinked. The priest. Margaret nodded miserably. He'd been siphoning relief funds to cover gambling debts. Finch felt the final pieces beginning to lock together. She confronted him. Yes. And? He begged her not to expose him publicly. Did she agree? At first. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. She believed shame would destroy the parish more than theft would. Finch moved closer. But something changed. Margaret nodded. She finally decided she had to tell the church board after the supper. Belle frowned. So why poison the pie? I didn't. The words burst out desperately. I swear to God, I didn't. Finch studied her silently. Then, what did you do? Margaret lowered her head. I prepared herbal heart tonic for Evelyn. Belle stared. You what? She'd been having chest episodes for weeks. She refused hospital treatment. Tears slipped down her cheeks now. I mixed small amounts of digitalis from my prescription the way we sometimes did years ago before stricter regulations. Finch's expression darkened. You gave unregulated cardiac medicine to a 68-year-old woman. She trusted me. Where did you place it? Margaret swallowed hard. In the butter glaze. Belle looked horrified. You brushed medication onto the shepherd's pie. It was only meant for Evelyn's portion, she whispered. A tiny amount. Finch understood immediately. 2 separate acts. 2 separate poisonings. 1 accidental. 1 deliberate. Someone added more afterward, he said quietly. Margaret looked up sharply. What? You're telling the truth. Belle turned toward Finch in confusion. How do you know? Because her dosage alone wouldn't explain the other victims. Finch's mind raced now. Margaret had unintentionally created the perfect delivery method. Someone else discovered it, enhanced it, weaponized it, and only one person still fit. Father Connolly, Finch said softly. St. Jude's Church smelled of candle wax and cold stone. Father Patrick Connolly sat alone in the chapel when Finch entered. Morning light spilled dimly through stained glass across the old priest's face. He looked smaller somehow without parishioners around him. Older. Frightened. He already knew. "You've come for me," he said quietly. Finch removed his hat. "Yes." The priest nodded once as though accepting overdue weather. "How much did Margaret tell you?" "Enough." Connolly stared toward the altar. "I never meant for Evelyn to die." "Don't insult me." The old priest flinched. Finch stepped closer. "You stole from the poor." Connolly's shoulders sagged. "At first I meant to repay it. Everyone says that. The debts became impossible." "Gambling." "Yes." Bell stood silently near the rear pews while Finch continued. "You discovered Margaret's medicinal glaze." Connolly closed his eyes. "I saw her preparing it in the kitchen. And realized you could use it. She planned to expose me after supper." His voice trembled weakly. "Everything would have collapsed. So you added concentrated digitalis to the glaze." The priest nodded faintly. "I only brushed Evelyn's side of the pie. And poisoned others anyway. I didn't think." "No," Finch said coldly. "You didn't." The chapel remained silent except for distant traffic outside. Finally Connolly whispered. "She spent her whole life feeding lonely people." Finch looked toward the stained glass windows. "Yes. And I killed her with supper." For the first time since entering, genuine horror entered the priest's voice. Not horror at arrest. At understanding himself. Finch had seen that before too. Usually too late. 3 evenings later, the Nag's Lantern overflowed with quiet conversation and damp coats once again. The church relief supper had been postponed, not cancelled. Mrs. Beatrice Hargreaves insisted upon that. "People still need feeding," she declared. And somehow that ended the discussion. Finch sat once more in the rear snug beneath the painting of hunting dogs while fresh shepherd's pie arrived steaming before him. Beatrice folded her arms. "You're staring at it like evidence." "I'm rebuilding trust." "That takes longer than pastry." "Potatoes," Finch corrected gently. "Whatever." Around them the pub buzzed softly with ordinary life returning by stubborn degrees. Pensioners argued over raffle tickets. A young couple laughed near the dartboard. Someone fed coins into the jukebox. London surviving itself again. Finch took a careful bite. The crust cracked perfectly beneath his fork. Rosemary. Butter. Lamb. Simple things. Beatrice watched him. "Well." He chewed thoughtfully. Then nodded once. "Still safe," he said. Something softened briefly in her expression. "That's what food's supposed to be." Finch looked around the crowded pub. Not luxury. Not performance. Not fashion. Safety. Warmth. Proof that somebody expected you to arrive hungry and intended to keep you alive another evening. Outside, rainwater still glimmered along the Clerkenwell streets beneath the lamps. And somewhere beyond the windows, London continued carrying its widows, gamblers, detectives, and lonely souls through another uncertain night. This concludes our episode. Please tune in again for more.
Strolling down the avenue, sky's looking bright and new. Got a feeling in my soul, taking back all my control. afternoon. Nothing left for me to say. Just let the music lead the way. Yeah, lead the way. Feeling fine today.